History is not written by slogans. It is written by consequences. And in early 2025, the United States is living inside what was sold as strength has become isolation. What was framed as leverage has turned into self-sabotage. And what was promised as America first is quietly becoming America alone. This was supposed to be a simple move. Raise tariffs, apply pressure, force compliance. Instead, the unthinkable happened. Canada and Mexico stopped reacting to Washington and started building around it. Not protesting, not retaliating loudly, but restructuring an entire continent without us. If you're waiting for a dramatic collapse, you're looking in the wrong place. The real disaster is quieter. It's written into shipping routes, factory floors, and energy pipelines that no longer point toward the United States. If you want to understand how power is actually lost in the modern world, keep listening. Because before we talk about consequences, we must first confront the illusion that created them. Let's strip away the theater and name the problem clearly. This crisis is not about borders. It is not about migration. It is not even about trade deficits. It is about a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern economies function. The administration believed the North American economy was a set of separate nations, loosely connected, easily pressured. That assumption was wrong. North America is not three economies. It is one system, a single production platform where parts, energy, food, capital, and labor move in constant circulation. Interrupt one artery, and the damage spreads everywhere, including back to the hand holding the knife. The 25% tariff was not a negotiating tactic. It was a systemic shock. And when systems are shocked, they do not respond emotionally. They adapt structurally. Canada and Mexico understood something Washington ignored. You don't fight an integrated system with threats. You redesign it so the threat becomes irrelevant. This is the moment where policy turns into architecture. And once architecture changes, politics struggles to catch up. To see why this reaction was inevitable, we need to go backward into how North America was actually built. To understand why this rupture happened so fast, you have to understand what North America really was before it broke. For 30 years, trade agreements didn't just reduce tariffs, they rewired geography. Factories were designed across borders. Supply chains were optimized for trust, not nationalism. The logic was simple: build once, produce everywhere, sell together. An engine block cast in Canada, wiring harnesses assembled in Mexico, final assembly in the United States. Not because of ideology, but because it worked. This wasn't globalism in theory. It was efficiency in practice. USMCA didn't create this system. It codified what markets had already built, but here's the mistake policymakers made. They thought this integration was reversible. They assumed borders could be thickened without consequences, that trust could be paused, that history could be rewound with executive orders. It can't. Economic integration is not a switch. It's a dependency. And when you threaten a dependency, rational actors don't plead. They prepare exits. That preparation began quietly long before the tariffs were announced. And when the shock finally came, it didn't produce chaos. It triggered the first break. The first visible fracture came quickly, and it came with a shock. In March 2025, the tariffs landed. 25%, blanket, indiscriminate. Overnight, the North American automotive system seized. Ontario plants slowed within days. Factories in Baguio began halting shifts, not because demand vanished, but because parts stopped moving. This was the moment Washington expected surrender. A flurry of phone calls, emergency summits, public contrition. None came because retaliation is noisy, and losing. Canada and Mexico chose something quieter, smarter. They stopped thinking like targets and started thinking like architects. Instead of fighting the tariff, they redesigned the map around it. What followed was not announced with fireworks. No grand speeches, just coordination, joint task forces, aligned ministries, shared pain assessments. Economists in Mexico gave it a name, Plan D. D for decoupling, not ideological decoupling, survival decoupling. This was the moment the crisis stopped being temporary. When emergency response became long-term strategy. If you think this was an overreaction, pause here. Because the next step wasn't emotional, it was structural. And once structure changes, leverage disappears. What Canada and Mexico built next was not a protest, it was a system. The strategic partnership they announced wasn't about slogans or symbolism. It was about removing dependency precisely where dependency hurt most. 3 pillars defined it. First, energy. Reducing exposure to American supply by accelerating Canadian LNG capacity and channeling it directly toward Mexican demand. Second, food. Replacing American grain, dairy, and produce with alternatives sourced from each other and from new partners beyond the United States. But the third pillar mattered most. Logistics. For decades, trade between Canada and Mexico flowed through American arteries. Interstates, rail hubs, border crossings. The United States wasn't just a partner, it was the gatekeeper. So they built a bypass, direct maritime routes linking Canada's Pacific ports with Mexico's western coast. New shipping lanes that treated the United States not as a hub, but as optional terrain. This wasn't punishment. It was adaptation. And here is the brutal truth of systems. Once a bypass exists, the old road never regains its monopoly. What had been leverage became irrelevance, and the industry that felt it first, felt it hardest, was the one meant to be protected. The second crisis arrived where denial was no longer possible. American manufacturing. Nowhere was the damage clearer than in autos, the most integrated industrial system on Earth. There is no such thing as an American car. There are only North American ones. A pickup assembled in Michigan depends on aluminum from Canada, electronics from Mexico, components that cross borders multiple times before a vehicle ever rolls off a line. The tariff didn't protect this system. It taxed it. A 25% levy on inputs became a 25% penalty on American producers. Costs surged. Timelines collapsed. Exports became uncompetitive overnight. Meanwhile, something else happened quietly. Under their new agreement, Canada and Mexico removed friction between themselves. Parts flowed freely. Paperwork vanished. Efficiency returned, just not on American soil. A factory in Ontario could ship to Puebla without delay. A competitor in Michigan drowned in forms, inspections, and penalties. This was the inversion no one in Washington planned for. The free trade zone didn't disappear. It moved. And the United States found itself on the outside of a system it once designed. This wasn't a slowdown. It was a rerouting, and the consequences would not stay confined to factories. They were about to reach people. This is where the story stops being abstract and becomes personal. Because systems don't bleed. People do. If you live in Detroit, El Paso, Laredo, Buffalo, this wasn't a policy debate. It was a layoff notice, a silent factory floor, a trucking route that no longer makes sense. You were told these tariffs were for you, that the pain would be temporary. That sacrifice was patriotic. But here's the truth. No one said out loud, you were never the beneficiary. You were the buffer. When supply chains reroute, they don't pause out of loyalty. They move on. A customs broker loses clients. A warehouse sits half empty. A machine operator watches shifts disappear, not because of foreign competition, but because politics made their job unviable. And trust, once broken, does not come back on election night. If you are wondering why prices are higher, jobs are shakier, and promises feel hollow, this is why. This wasn't strength, it was volatility. And volatility always punishes the people least able to absorb it. If this resonates with you, don't tune out now. What's happening to individuals is about to scale globally. What began as a regional shock quickly became a global signal. Alliances watched behavior, not rhetoric. And what the world saw in 2025 was the United States treating its closest partners as expendable. That creates a vacuum. And vacuums never stay empty. As Washington focused on tariff schedules, other capitals moved quietly. Trade delegations arrived in Mexico City. Investment talks opened in Vancouver, not because Canada and Mexico wanted to pivot east, but because uncertainty forces diversification. When markets sense instability, they hedge. When allies feel threatened, they prepare alternatives. The Canada-Mexico corridor doesn't announce a new global order, but it accelerates one. It tells Europe, Japan, Australia a simple truth. The United States is no longer predictable. And predictability is power. Supply chains are now being designed with one assumption baked in, that American borders are friction points, not guarantees. That assumption will outlive this administration. Soft power erodes quietly. It doesn't collapse. It fades. And once the world learns it can function without you, persuasion becomes harder than pressure ever was. The question now isn't whether this shift matters. It's whether it can still be reversed. To answer that, we have to look forward and confront the paths now in front of us. From here, the future doesn't branch into dozens of possibilities. It narrows into three. The first is the optimistic path. Tariffs are rolled back. Damage is acknowledged. Trust is slowly rebuilt. The United States re-enters the system not as a bully, but as a stabilizer. This path exists, but it requires humility, patience, and political courage in short supply. The second path is the most likely. A cold equilibrium. Trade continues, but partnership is gone. Canada and Mexico deepen their corridor. The United States remains involved, just no longer central. Supply chains harden. Ports, pipelines, and rail lines lock in new habits that don't reverse easily. Then there is the third path, the dangerous one. A lost decade. Permanent decoupling by design. American borders become friction zones. Capital avoids uncertainty. Regional blocks form without us and eventually against us. This isn't punishment. It's math. Markets reward reliability. They punish volatility. The future won't be decided by speeches or elections alone. It will be decided by whether the United States relearns a simple truth. Power in the 21st century comes from being indispensable, not feared. And that brings us to the final question. What, if anything, can still be salvaged? History rarely announces its turning points. It whispers them through shipping routes that change, contracts that aren't renewed, partnerships that quietly expire. The tariff disaster of 2025 is one of those moments. It wasn't an act of strength. It was an admission of confusion, a belief that pressure could replace trust and that control could substitute for cooperation. The highest cost isn't higher prices or lost jobs, though those are real. The highest cost is the collapse of the North American idea itself. A continent bound by geography, values, and shared prosperity fractured by attacks on reality. Canada and Mexico didn't conspire. They adapted. They built a future that could function without American volatility. And that is the final indictment. Power isn't the ability to force others to comply. It's the ability to make cooperation the best option. If this story matters to you, don't let it end here. Question policies that promise strength but deliver isolation. Demand leadership that understands systems, not slogans. Because the disaster isn't coming. It's already here. And whether the next chapter is recovery or irrelevance depends on what we choose to learn from it.